Hello everyone, today we talk about the Cingulum militaris in the late Roman army. The Cingulum is the belt, as you know, so it is a very important symbol, right? And that basically equates to the military status that, as we have explained traditionally many times, was essentially that amount of imperium that you could bear. In other words, if you wore this military belt, you basically carried a weapon with that, and you were allowed by the imperial Catholic power to essentially use it, right, to a degree of freedom. In fact, that corresponded with to nobility, right? This is something I say often, especially for medieval warfare videos, but actually it comes straight from the ancient belief of that. If you're a freeman, you bear arms, right? And that means that if you're a true freeman, which is hard to be in absolute terms because there's always a hierarchy, and so you're always sinful to an extent which your power is not divine, so it's not perfect. But to some extent, in this fallen world, in the Iron Age, the last one, by the way, before the end time, you would bear, in fact, this weapon, and the earthly authorities, that were the media essentially of the heavenly one, recognized through this your own condition, right? And that's why it's such an important aspect of, well, normally you would read about the stuff more often again in an archaeological paper, right, about arms, armor, etc., the belt being some of the least things you would actually concentrate on according to that criterion, but actually being in many ways the most important, at least in the way it was socially recognized, because of course the weapon in itself was the most important thing. But that's also what it's interesting, that the importance of this belt increases from literally I don't know how to call this, like a clothing item, right? Even in a fashionable way in late Roman times, not in a linear way, right? There are ups and downs, as there are other, let's say, symbolisms that take place, or just even other practical solutions. For example, the baltus comes, as we will see now for a while, to substitute the cingulum in the material function of hanging the sword, specifically. In any case, this would always go in parallel with the capacity of the warrior, of course, of being recognized out there. I say the warrior, as we say the soldier, right? But as we will see now, a great influence during this time in the Roman military armament derives also from other peoples that had a different way of displaying their status, their power, mostly in the same way, speaking of the meaning of the weapon, and still with a different approach towards for example, the wealth of this belt and the way they were built, right? So the decline of the cingulum as such had already began from the early empire, gradually. Right, it had mechanically lost the same originary function of literally holding the sword, often in favor, as we were saying, of the simple baltus that was worn just diagonally across the chest. There is not a satisfactory answer why this change. It's not immediately evident, even when you think about the passage from the gladius to the spata, right? That technically had actually always remained there. Like, there is this rightful suspicion, in fact, that there were probably much more swordsmen using the spata than we think in early imperial times as well, and cavalry weapons. So one of higher, say, the equipment of somebody with a higher status than the average legionnaire was normally the spata, already in early imperial times, in the few legionary cavalry that was deployed by the Romans. We tend to see the early empire a bit too much of a democratic reality, let's say, than it had ever been. Especially in Rome, democracy never existed as an actual form of government. It was always an oligarchy that now had turned into a monarchy, by the way. But the concept of social status differences is something we should recover much more, also for these earlier times, and also the ones before, telling the truth. What happens in late Roman times regarding to the Cingulum and the Baltus as well is the ever richer garnishment with precious ornamental plaques, constituting, in fact, the characteristic element of the clothing, the so-called military habitus in Latin. That was, in fact, the index, you can say, the measure of the legionnaire's welfare condition in many ways. One explanation regarding the rising importance of the Baltus is that it could be more easily displayed than the Cingulum. So, as we will see now, it would be overloaded with symbols of power that, especially in the 4th century, say in the Constantinian era, it seems in fact to have been prevalent because of all the systems of honors. I made a video about the Constantinian system if you're interested, but you know, right, there were much more rigid social classes, and especially a true increase of oligarchic power. And it's as if, as we will see now at the end of the 4th century, especially in the 5th, the Cingulum, also for the Federati, came back more strong, also for the Federati as long as they had been Romanized, but also because of them, from them, because with the evaporation, especially the western half of the empire, you notice that re-equilibration of wealth, even though it was technically not so in most Romano-Germanic contexts, it's just also the system that sort of shrinks once again, and there is an overall decay, but in many cases, in fact, this also corresponded to a collapse of the state, and so the freemen were freer to some extent, at least. It was not actually corresponding, at least necessarily corresponding to an actually better living condition in absolute terms. But the sense was again that culture became a bit more private, so you would also have to carry the sword because it was a more dangerous world. You needed to police to govern it itself. And so there we enter in the early Middle Ages, and we talked about medieval sword and all this broader implication. We will talk about this hopefully soon more and more in depth, because it's not immediately let's say intuitive, but the most important thing is the idea that the Baltus sort of corresponded to this last great moment of prosperity of the United Empire, where, however, the social differences were increasing dramatically, and so again, through the Baltus you could expose better what your status was, but after that system collapsed, there was no need to do that, right? Your belt sufficed, a bit like it could be in the steppe to some degree in Central Europe, etc. So you see, the Romans had come from that same sort of context mentally and socially, and so there you have a coming back of the Cingulum, as we will see now, which is also for hanging the sword literally over the Baltus in preference. We're not overwhelmingly documented at that point, but that's the trend that we measure. So there were naturally different types of Cingulum construction, as far especially as the fastening mechanism was concerned. In the 3rd century, the wide Baltus was supporting the spatha, as we've seen, acquiring in turn an ornamental function with the presence of falere and of more or less richly decorated finements that often set the Cingulum aside, right? the buckle becomes, in many cases, a square or a simple metallic ring around which, with in different ways, the extremities of the belt were fastened, as it can be actually seen in many instances in the numerous monuments, funerary reliefs of the time. There were buckles with brooches too. This doesn't mean, by the way, that the Cingulum militaris disappeared at all. What I forgot to say, the most important thing actually at the beginning, is that, at least for those who do not know, the Cingulum militaris, especially, say, in the acme of Roman power in general, we can think about the early empire, but throughout all this period and before, was the first indicator of the military status of the individual. Right, the Roman Empire, to an important extent, as you know, had been disarmed. Right, there was actually room for militias from some degree, of course, of armament. But generally speaking, the Pax Romana had established just an order, a balance that did not need properly the citizens to arm themselves. So what happens in the later Roman Empire is something slightly different. Here we're still talking about a moment of peak of Roman power, still again the Constantinian era, mostly the moment in which the Baltus increases, or at least peaks in importance. And yet the Cingulum is still the symbol of the military. And I say this as far because we've made videos about uniforms in general, the concept of homogenization, uniformation, that to some is controversial. Like if you speak about uniforms for the ancient world, there is some purist that will come telling you, but there were no uniforms. There weren't in the modern sense, but of course a level of uniformation was there. Right? Doesn't mean, again, I'm one of the strongest proponents, of course, of the incredible heterogeneity of a Roman legionary look in many ways. And very often the same people who reject that do not understand the extent which this is true. But we must understand what is uniformity in this regard, and the idea of bearing arms as such, so the Cingulum that held them, was the first indicator of that guy is a soldier. Everybody knew that, right? Also because soldiers, again, had very specific privileges, right? If they built the roads, and as such, you had to let them pass. They always had the precedence. They had some status, again, that was thought of to be magic, sacred, to an extent that in pop culture is not represented really in our times, for how deeply felt it was, actually, even in times of sort of popularization of the legionary forces. I mean, the pretty large amount of proletarians that joined, etc. But there was always an initiatic right, was always beyond the dimension. When you entered the military, that was considered extremely powerful and dangerous, and again overloaded with religious meanings. But of course, if you do not teach history like that, nobody can really understand that, right? It's just a deterministic, materialistic superstition at that point, not history. So we do find actually particularly elaborated cingula. Cingula is the plural of cingulum. I'm using, by the way, for today's video, the ecclesiastical pronunciation because we're talking late Roman times, so otherwise it would have been cingulum, but it's just, here a convention that I use on the channel. We do not really know how they literally spoke, but more or less we think that late Roman times things, became a bit softer, so cingulum would go along. And remember, for what I just said regarding the military identity made by the Cingulum, that of course in medieval times the knight is the knight because of the Cingulum, right? So in spite of this Baltus times that sort of came around in late antiquity, the Cingulum survived throughout all the time we are covering and would still prevail. Beyond aside, of course, from all the, and especially I would say in this sense, in importance the various ways of much more complicated ways of armament, especially for those who had the Cingulum militaris. I mean, think about all the straps knights use and so on. This would be, in fact, interesting to scope by looking at other peoples, especially such as the Sarmatians, right? Who brought that sort of knightly capacity that had surely incredibly complex systems to bear arms, at least to actually just remain on horseback, because they didn't have stirrups yet, such. So how did they held the contas with the bridles, etc. There are all studies that deal exactly with all the organic material lost, that unfortunately for other people also we do not understand quite clearly. But for these times, for the Romans, for the Germans, we have a pretty good idea of what we're talking about here. This particularly elaborated cingula would be enriched by plaques with pretty fine decorations. Naturally, as you understand here, in parallel with the wealth of the soldier, which, as you know, especially in Constantinian times, was quite marked, right? There was a greater hierarchy. There were sort of more elite-picked troops as opposed to others that had lost even that function of of heavy infantrymen, right? And because, of course, the same army now didn't have as many auxiliaries as before. It's debatable, but let's say now that the Roman trooper could be just a skirmisher, let's say, and not necessarily the best equipped comitatensis equus, let's say, that would find also dismounted. But here we're not talking just about infantry anyway, but just comparing to the dimensions now, the specialties that a Roman legionnaire could have. I mean, a Roman soldier serving in a legion would, or its equivalent would have compared to previous times, where basically just the Roman citizenry would virtually all heavy infantrymen and very few horsemen, and all the rest of the tactical specialties were cultivated by the auxiliaries. Not entirely. It's not so simple. It's not even so simple for late Roman times as well, because the degrees of, especially of multiple specialization and hyper specialization, even within the same unit, were really impressive. But that's something we're going to look at in another video. And these decorations would bear often inscriptions such as spes, so hope, utere felix, which basically means good luck, etc. So all these, this wishful, apotropaic, religious, positive, ideals. And remember that these are words written on the cingulum, right? So it's as if the imperium there had been conferred with this extra magic power that the letter had, also in a, by the times, quite modern and secular reality like the Roman one. Of course, was incredibly unsecular, incredibly unmodern compared to any standard that not just we have today, but that we have popularly been told to believe that word to have been. And we have many, really many finds. There are beautiful ones in Germany at the Augsburg Museum. The one we're talking about with spes is from a plaque for a cingulum from the Archaeological Museum of Munich. The utere felix was found in Lyon in a tomb. So we have different good examples of all these aspects. Let's say the structure, the leather belt, of course, mostly is at best in traces, right? But we have a pretty good idea of how these structures really looked. Otherwise, we have them. So in the last example, the one of Lyon, the leather finial of the belt, at least in the way it is reconstructed, considering the broader circumference, is remarkably much longer and tighter compared to the older models. And this has to do with a widespread fashion at the time that saw the belt basically fastened different turns around the principal body of the belt in order to eventually fall in the front on the right, and often splitting like at the end in one or more finials, right? So with two tails, let's say. It was just a way it was structured and worn. We have a beautiful 4th century cingulum from the Hungarian find of Zengo Varkony. It's a very good example. Now, in the 4th century, you have, as you know, in the Roman army, an important influence of the Germanic peoples through the many federati that served in the Roman army. As such, the cingulum, albeit at this point without reacquiring the support function for the sword, right? At least by this point, we're not at the end of the century yet. It's still supplanted by the Baltius largely. However, it comes back to be richly decorated and to acquire a important function in the soldiers' clothing, especially on the Rhine and the northern Gallic frontiers. This has to do with a custom that the Germans had essentially inherited, and or at least they had in common with the steppes peoples. That is to say, in these poor semi-nomadic cultures, a way to show off more clearly who you were was loading literally what you went at war with wealth. Right? It's typical of the steppe to have precious metals like encrusting the hilts, the helmets, and so on, because these peoples were often just on the move, and it was sort of easier, paradoxically, to even just to save these pieces, to have them at all times on you. There was still the spiritual, symbolic, religious meaning. These precious metals, remember, were thought to be purer materials than the rest of the fallen world, and so closer to God. And if you had them with you, there literally was some power within them. The societies actually were already, you see here, losing that sense of especially with the end of the Roman Empire and the trail of it, even among the barbarians, of the capacity of man to actually save himself alone. So they were resorting to, in the dark times that they were, because the migration era was actually terrible for every single people involved, the sort of talismanic, right, superstitious protection deriving just from the touch of this more precious material. Another reason was political, military, let's say, in organization, especially. I mean, the idea that warbanders, for example, were more prone to expose themselves and showing off in order to gain, maybe to become the actual chiefs of the band and to gather other followers, would make these guys like showing how much wealth they had accumulated through their loot, and so how successful they were as warriors, because there was really not much of another way to measure it, because the surplus, the agricultural surplus, of course, in any pre-industrial society, but especially in the poorer barbaricum, was ridiculous. So that's why these peoples were also warlike, because in order to become richer fast, or even just surviving, they had to kill the others, all right, or to subjugating them and taking their wealth. So let's say more than elsewhere in, say, even in the among the Germanic federati, it was a fashion, at least this was declined by different degree, to show off more wealth, right? And lots of Roman soldiers are exactly of Germanic descent, origin, and or they are even just influenced by Germanic fashions, especially as we've seen in this western frontier. But not only. There are similar dynamics also with other peoples, right? If you look at the Iranians, or even at some point even the Turks on the Sasanian frontier, you have the same concepts. So the characteristic 4th century Cingulum presents also, by the way, is a greater height compared to the one of the previous models, and it turns out to be constituted generally by a buckle, a plaque, and a counterplaque of large size. Predictably, this goes in parallel with a series of ornated accessories. We find, for example, some buttonholes and reinforcements, and also by a series of rings destined to support and transport various personal items. As you understand, this goes in parallel with what we were just saying about the Germanic peoples and the general influences received by the Romans from the Barbaricum. Essentially here you get a bulkier belt that may have even some, like everything does, right? If you think about the pteryges or other sort of organic materials, say mild protection, like the belt gets something especially more defensive for also mounted warfare. And these let's say reinforcements, as we've seen in buttonholes, the need to carry, as we've seen, to attach to the belt other items, definitely speaks for this enhanced equestrian dimension. This surely is an influence received from the Reitervölker as well, but surely also from within a Roman social stratification that we were discussing, also because the say, depending on wealth, of course, also the fines tend to differ. Over time, we get to see mostly the belts of the most affluent soldiers, right? So the sense that the Roman legionnaire during the 4th century is turning in a bit more of a warrior yet again, especially for this evidently sort of richer belts that were not what the average soldier would have, is quite telling. And in fact, as we were predicting, we'll see now where the thing culminates. In this type of higher belt, we find on the extremity usually fixed metallic finial, generally shaped as a vase, as an amphora, basically. This is just, instead cultural as a thing. I don't think we know what's the meaning of this. It's sort of the idea that the belt comes out like, wine out of this recipient. We find, for example, in Sirmium, perfectly shaped amphora find. This comes from a private collection. Now I don't even remember which. There were other designs, however. There were mostly geometric patterns, but you find sort of helix, for example, and these were all symbols, right? Also broader geometrical, universal, cosmic power, right? Whatever the meaning here, we should have asked the guy who were making them. And this aspect, these details, did really matter. So the buckles take on different shapes, forms, usually zoomorphic ones, by the way. Very frequent is the dolphin motif as well. Towards the 4th century, the dragon, however, becomes predominant. And this is fascinating because it goes in parallel with the video I made last spring about the dracones in the Roman army. This is also a very prepotent Eurasian steppe symbol. The bit of chthonic dimension enters after all, because the dragon, yes, also if you look at China's symbol, wisdom, whatever, is true still as a chthonic animal that must be, at the end of the day, killed. And in order to be just like the snake, right, to get its wisdom, but is an opponent, is a provoker, right? Look at Siegfried with the dragon's blood, etc. Or Achilles with this sacred springs. There are still all chthonic symbols of some sort of underworldly wisdom that you must tame and dominate. We have a beautiful buckle found in Winchester dating to the 4th century. You can Google. Here I don't have the pictures because they're all copyright unfree, so I can't use them, but that's Schwerpunkt's policy, to be safe and stable in everything. The most precious belt plates appear more frequently between the 4th and the 5th century. And this again speaks a bit of the sort of feudalization of the army. For at least the best soldiers that we have, and that left these more expensive belts that sort of survived but that were preserved more easily than the others. There is a carving technique, especially through which these most precious plates were realized, that is known as Karbschnitt in German. And if you look at them, really, even among other peoples now, between the 4th and 5th centuries, we've seen the Roman or Germanic styles are very much out there as a synthesis. They are very, very well realized, right, with great care, attention to details, and they can be tinned, silvered, or even gilded. Remember what we said before about precious metals as a sort of hierarchy of, say, closeness to divinity, right? So again, it's obvious that the soldiers with the most expensive equipment were just more important people, and hopefully better soldiers, or at least coming from backgrounds that, as we've seen recently also in the video about Diocletian's attachment of individuals to their families' profession, throughout the generations were sort of producing such soldiers, and just aristocrats, of course, when at war, not just as officers, by the way, right? At least they were hoping for that, but some would have had to really earn their chevrons also in some more humble role, relatively humble role. And here it could be horsemen, still powerful troops. You have a beautiful carved bronze plate of the Karbschnitt type dating to the 5th century, and found in Wessling, preserved today at the Archaeological Museum of Munich. We have some remains of a Cingulum dating to roughly the 70s of the 4th century, preserved at the Rijksmuseum van Hoogheden of Leiden, dating, as we've seen, to this Constantinian era. When I say Constantinian Roman army, I don't mean literally the army at the time of Constantine, just the emperor, the single emperor's biological time span. I'm talking the Constantinian army, basically the one that emerged from Constantine's reforms and that lasted as an astonishingly effective system until more or less the time of Adrianople. Right, so as we've seen here, the last was from the 70s. Let's pass to the later 4th century, where you see here the most interesting change. That is to say, the Cingulum actually coming back, also as far as the sword hanging function was concerned, or the Baltus, because the system was sort of collapsing as we've seen, and or at least was being greatly reduced. There were more Germans around, some settling. Properly permanently, or at least within as a single people within the Roman frontier. And we see here the height of at least the leather part of the belt increasing, surpassing even 10 centimeters, right? It's a lot. And as a consequence, there is aside from the possible protection function this had, there is also just structurally need, in order to make it functional, to stiffen it with specific long and thin reinforcements. The rings are installed also on the upper edge of the belt, probably to connect them to one or more bandoliers, right? So the thing is becoming even more complex, right? And as we were saying, from the 5th century, at least in many cases, the cingulum seems to come back holding directly the sword. A beautiful example of this type is, at least for the reconstruction we can make from the finds, the late 4th century cingulum from Dorchester, preserved today at the Ashmolean Museum of Oxford. So this is more or less the trend that I was exemplifying at the beginning, right? Sort of aristocratization of belt, say military belts during, say, Constantinian times, as long as the system holds with that sort of more aristocratic, socially stratified formula. And then in later times we have a collapse, whereby the cingulum comes back to be particularly important, but differently from the previous type. In Roman times, we will see in another video, was higher, was something sort of more connected in a almost, again, with a greater system, right, of straps, of bandoliers, that suggests that especially the equestrian function of this design was out there, at least for a more complex type of warfare that was, let's say, it's difficult to make the exact comparison, but still, again, remember which kind of belts we're talking about, how expensive are they, right? And from this we realize, at least from the finds, these belts are probably for more aristocratic individuals than the early imperial legionnaire. So it sort of makes sense because, again, in late antiquity and the early Middle Ages, cavalry is increasing in importance, and so the belt follows a bit this pattern, right? And then later designs are something we can see in another video, perhaps dedicated to the fact that Eastern Rome, how it kept evolving from there, especially under continuous influence, not just from the Germans, but probably from steppe peoples that kept pouring during the later centuries as well, and by whom, as we've seen, the same Germans were influenced a lot. So that's one of the most important things to bear in mind at the end of the day. So it's just a video like this. Every once in a while, I'm not an archaeologist, I'm not even particularly versed in this type of technical descriptions, but I like to make sense as a military historian of the actual function that these items really have, and at least I always find some valid explanation for it, right? At least I'm sure that there are specialists that can tell better, but let's say the macroscopic trends seem to me pretty evident. Right, they correspond to what we generally know about the Roman army, so everything makes sense, and it doesn't seem like anything particularly strange, and it always matches with chronology, with the actual events. So that's actually what, as far as I've seen, by my few experience with archaeologists, that say archaeologists, or at least that branch in general, tends to stop. Okay, we have the evidence, let's describe it, point, right? And then that's the most important thing. Then the rest, there are also more, say, practical, of course, issues, but not more from experimental archaeology, but meaning, how were this case, the Cingulum built like this, the buckles, etc. But you always must find, because you see, archaeologists are technically not military historians, even those that specialize in actual military archaeology. They're not habituated to that sort of diachronic and comparative work that at least good military historians should do, and so they stop a bit to the functionality of the object. Of course, there are very good military archaeologists that can provide, again, much better explanations than my own, but say, seeing it, considering what is happening quite plastically, from the mind of a military historian who spent a considerable amount of time studying late Roman warfare, well, it's something you don't have at least to give for granted, and that I always like to exercise in, and I hope to be able to contribute at least as a voice to these hypotheses. And I think we know, at least the most enlightened military archaeologists surely are able, again, to connect these dynamics that I just exposed to the models we have here, to the evidence is provided. One always must think about all the factors, of course the productive ones as well, the cost. And with archaeology, the problem, as always, is that we do not have satisfactory statistical evidence. At least you can have some of that, but there is also lots of stuff that you don't see, exactly because of what you can see is there, right? So at that point, when there is too much positivism or determinism regarding to these facts, I don't, I remember, just anecdotally, but this has nothing to do with the video, but a couple of years, it was last year ago, I was talking to a Scottish archaeologist. Well, basically she was very pretty, but she said something that turned me off immediately. She said was, oh wow, you're an archaeologist, whatever. And she said something along the line of, because I asked why she got to this, etc., that she studied history or something, I don't remember exactly, but that she took a dislike to the written documents, because she didn't say it explicitly, but I understood the fact that, to her it's just an opinion of what the person writes. Yes, as if, there was any other way to make history, by the way, and the worst being, you can debate, of course, on that, but the worst being that, of course, she turned to something like, because she was a medieval archaeologist as well, and she turned instead to studying sea levels in early medieval Scotland, because she said, that's a much better, more concrete way to explain how history happened. Yeah, I stopped interacting with her at that point, because the sense was, you don't like historiography from the actual times. Well, I didn't ask that, but how exactly, through studying sea levels, can you understand the history of Scotland at the time? I mean, literally. I know that the most naive people can say something completely detached from how we actually get anything to know anything from history. But, it's not that if you know what sea levels were in Scotland at a given time or another, that you actually can change the history of Scotland by any relevant degree, right? And when we can study this also for other countries, that's basically the same thing, right? What we get historically at every level, political, military, social, is from written evidence, from actual archaeology, meaning things like today's videos, like, at least how a belt at the time was made, and through the written sources you can, without which you wouldn't know much about how these peoples actually fought or whatever, and what was the general situation at the time in such a big system, you wouldn't know practically anything, right? This is notorious, like pick, I don't know, Central Europe at this point. You think you can actually you can tag, I don't know, different Germanic tribes through archaeology? Good luck with that. Just if you do not have a written documentary evidence, a chronology about what people was there, which time, there's no way to do so, right? And it's not that in that case, I don't know, the water level, the sea level in Scotland ever changed to a degree by which we should be concerned about having gotten even a single branch or topic of medieval Scotland right so far. It's not that in the future we're going to teach differently the history of Scotland if we know that, I don't know, the sea level rose 5 centimeters. It's utterly ridiculous. But these are the kind of people you meet, because in parallel with that, you look at their personas, and you realize that these people are basically frustrated with something with their life, right? They want... It's as if they refuse to accept that life is complicated, and that have to make sense of things, looking at the most difficult things in order to actually get the most important ones, right? And this is a constant escapism from one's already limitations. Like it's as if you wanted to sort something out, you realize it's difficult, so you pass to something simpler, as if that actually had any positive effect on your self-development, right? That's pretty bizarre, to say the least. So to me, the question is much more about being humble, because what you read written by people is something that you have the absolute privilege of having. And if you study history, you even realize how much written records are actually correct, and or they give you, even indirectly sometimes, some information just in the frames and mindset of the actual source regarding what they're really telling you. You spitting on them saying, well, I just study archaeology, because it means that you're terribly ungrateful. And that's the worst thing of all in life, I think. It's the concept. You have so much. You're not even looking at that. You're just saying, I refuse to be the better person I can be. Because, and that goes all along with behavior, right? This girl was, I don't know, what she seemed very nice, telling the truth, as, especially from a biological point of view. But you'd expect, again, an educated person, she, has some interest in the same period. It's brutal, lack of sensitivity towards the actual disciplines that, transforming history to Soviet history, pure materialism and nothing else. Like, it's horrifying, to say the least. And by the way, this is not to say that, by the way, Scotland, I don't know what she studied, but I assume also before she studied Scottish history. Yes, it's not a particularly documented area of Europe for especially the times she got interested in, but still the written tradition is pretty rich. I mean, you can't get a lot of stuff from that. You can, that may be frustrating, that may bring people again that have, again, a more material interest, whatever, towards this other side of the aisle, let's put it this way, but at the same time I really can't understand that. It's maybe, okay, I'm a spoiled 13th, 14th century specialist, for which I can keep writing on the basis of my PhD thesis for forever, given that the amount of material available, especially from written tradition. But history never ends quite at that, right? Aside from my jokes about antiquists, just going around in circles, most of them actually end up doing so, at least as historiographically they tend just to be never getting to any point, never unbalancing themselves, never actually making the greater effort that they could easily make comparatively by studying this stuff. I think it's always a part of the problem in some ways. So my old sort of grandpa style complaints about the world further degenerating into the abyss. But, what can you do? You see here, we got up from the fall of the Roman Empire, so if we can't go, say, we declined in many ways further, but at least if we want to stick to the materialistic superstition, there are ways out of that. There are ways you can come up again. Say, I stopped to the Middle Ages. Let's make the deal. In any case, for today, I stop it here. We will keep talking about similar topics about properly the Roman, late Roman in this case, armament. And recently I've been posting interesting things, I would say, about late Roman warfare. We haven't even begun. Like, for all the videos I've made so far, it seems like still too few. However, I think, I'd say, if you today's video, if you enjoyed it, of course, please subscribe, leave a comment. I even enabled the how do you call them? Not the subscription. Yeah. What it is, the whatever, the payment thing. I added a bunch of garbage you can use with, on the channel. It's just tiny, cute ranks, with the eagles sort of becoming adult and all this stuff over time, and more some stickers with traditional symbols. It's not garbage really, but it's, for, I think I said $2.99 a month or something like that. You can check that out. For today, however, it's all. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time.